Hey adventurers, so today's going to be another book review. This is going to be for The Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis. This is a fantasy, an epic fantasy, high fantasy, action, adventure, quest, political, a little bit feels a little bit like classic fantasy to some degree. And yeah, so kind of a lot of subgenres, as really most books and most fantasy books especially are. But yeah, let's get into this. So Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis is the first book in the Dance of Light series. So it's a series which is good to know going into this review and going into the series, into the book. This is a true high fantasy world and story, which very much harkens back and pays homage to the greats of the genre, to Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, many of these series that you know, and that when somebody says high fantasy or epic fantasy, you immediately associate with those terms. And it pays homage a little bit, but it also harkens back in the way that it's written, in the way that it tells the story to those greats. This was a decent read. Like I mentioned, it feels very much like a classic fantasy, like the classic fantasy we grew up reading, and that's really a wonderful thing. That's actually a high point for this story in so many ways, and I'll talk more about that as I go. Especially in this time of publishing, where the focus is to move away from the more Tolkienian fantasy. And I think for someone new to adult fantasy, this would actually be a really good starting place. And I'll mention that again towards the end of the review and maybe talk a little bit more about that. It very much follows a lot of the general tropes that we have come to associate with epic and coming of age fantasy stories. The difference with this one is that our main character has already been training and is more than proficient. He's a good warrior, good swordsman, and that's a little bit of a different dynamic than we usually see. It actually makes a new and interesting twist that makes the story stand out a bit, and that's kind of something cool that this story does that I don't always see with other stories. Before I continue on here, I'd just quickly like to say though, if you're liking what you're seeing from an Erudite adventurer, please like, comment, and subscribe. Alright, so we get some really decent world building here, which is fairly easy to do in a book such as this due to the fact that the character is traveling across the world. Anytime you have a quest where you can travel across the world, you can very easily incorporate world building into that story in a way that fits really well, and you can just slip the information in there without it feeling info dumpy. It can, but it's really easy just to be like, oh, and this is the new thing that we're learning about because this is where we're at. There's some really good stuff in this book, and really a lot to like. But I did also notice a few scenes where I was just thinking, like, why is this included? What does it actually add to the story that's being told? I'm not sure. It's possible. Maybe it's the case that it is there for future books in the series. If that's the case, that's great. That no reason not to include it at that point. But for this one, I was thinking, like, why is this here? I don't see how it fits into the greater story as a whole. I'm not opposed to some less obviously necessary sequences, but in general, I don't want it to feel out of place with the story that I'm reading. And that's really why I made note of them in this review and as I was reading, was this feels out of place for the story that's being told. And whereas that same exact sequence could happen in a different type of book, in a different type of story being told, and be like, that makes perfect sense why it's there. Whereas this one, it didn't fit to me. In my opinion, it didn't fit. So that's really why I question why it's there. And while I'm here, I'll use the example of Tom Bombadil in The Lord of the Rings. That feels very out of place with this story to many. And because of that, it's so hard to adapt, and nobody wants to see Tom Bombadil. Well, everybody does, but everybody thinks it was the right decision to remove him from the Peter Jackson films. And I agree, even as much as I love Tom Bombadil, but he's kind of something that's weird within the story. It doesn't seem to add anything to the story being told until you realize what the story really is that's being told with Lord of the Rings, and until you realize that as they're exploring the world, there's things that happen in the world. There's things that they come across that are unexplained to them, or unexplainable even to them, because that's not important to the story that's going on. However, this interaction might be, even though it's in a small way important. And that's not what we get with this one. At least I don't feel it is. I feel like the couple scenes that I'm thinking of are just like, why did you include this? How does this benefit anything? Whereas with Tom Bombadil, I absolutely can see how he benefits the world and the story and everything going on in that book. Anyways, let's continue. The writing was fairly good, though it felt a bit like a modern author attempting to write with an older or like a higher style, if you will. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that I feel like it didn't seem to be quite as polished as I would like to have seen it. It feels like the author was trying to do that because that's what you're supposed to do as a fantasy author, and instead of committing fully to that, he was also incorporating this modern writing style into that style, and they kind of didn't blend quite as well as I think that he was hoping for. I don't know that. That's my opinion based on what I was reading of the book, and so maybe some other people think differently about that. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't as polished. As I said, it's not as polished as I'd have liked to see. I did read this, or at least I started reading this at a good time for me, because it was as I was in a readathon with a whole bunch of other people. My group had chosen this book for our group book to read, and so it was really good for me because I was able to participate in the conversation with everybody else. I did come to it a little bit late, so what happened with this book is I started reading it in the month that we were doing the readathon, I think that was August, and I ran out of time. And like I started it, and then I sped it up and sped it up and sped it up and sped it up until it was so fast that I actually could not understand the story that was happening. At that point I was just reading it to mark it off and say that I'd completed it before the end of the month, and that wasn't a good thing to do. That was unnecessary. I shouldn't have done that. What I should have done is I should have just listened to it at the 2x2 speed, which is normal for me, and then when I finished the story, whether it was before the end of the month or not, then I would be fine, and we would just deal with it at that point. That's what I should have done, but I didn't. And so what I ended up doing is I stopped listening to it, and I said, okay, I would rather be able to write a good review of this book in terms of the quality of the review, not my opinion of the book. Write a quality review of this book rather than finish it before the end of the month. And so what I did is I stopped reading it, and I just said I'll come back to it later. And what I did is at that point I restarted listening to it, started from the beginning again, and listened to the whole thing, and I was able to understand it, and I was able to get the story that was happening there significantly better than the first time that I tried to speed read it, which really didn't work. And so it was good for me to go back, but it allowed me to, even though I was a little bit late because of that, I was still able to communicate or to participate in the conversation going around this book, and that was beneficial for me and enjoyable for me. Anyways, story time has taken too long now. Where am I at? So this isn't a new favorite for me. I enjoyed it well enough, but it's not a new favorite, and I'm not sure if I will continue with the series or not. Though I'm not really opposed to it. I could continue with the series, or I could not continue with the series. It's just one that I'm just like, I'm not being called to pick up the next one at the moment, but I'm also not opposed to it if I ever get the opportunity, or if it's ever just like, you know what, this sounds really fun, I want to continue with that. I'm not opposed to it at all. Just at the moment, I'm not immediately drawn to pick up the next book. But yeah, I do think that this would actually be a really good entry point for somebody new to adult fantasy. It's new and fresh enough that you're going to find something interesting if you haven't read as broadly as even I have, which I don't feel like I've read that broadly. There's definitely other people who have read significantly more books than I have, and more types of books and everything. And so what I'm saying is that I think for a new reader, somebody who's just getting into adult fantasy, who's maybe only ever read middle grade fantasy or young adult or something like that, and is just now getting into this more adult fantasy, I think it's a good entry point, and I think it's a good like bridge book between those two age classifications. Yeah, I think that it's a good entry point for adult fantasy, and I think that's actually a good thing to market this book as, and a good draw for it to be. So anyways, that is my review for Return of the Knights by Gregory Kontaxis. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite adventure. We will see you guys again soon. Stay well.